Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks to everyone who has joined us. We're delighted to welcome you to the Columbia Center of Sustainable Investments, speaker series, which for the first time, we're going to do it virtually. We were just speaking about this. This is something that we have done now for a couple of years in person. We're now for the first time doing it virtually. And I think it's safe to say we're excited. We're excited for a couple of reasons. One reason is that we can reach a much wider audience. So that is exciting for us. Another reason is that we can get fabulous speakers who are very busy and otherwise would find it difficult to travel to New York to talk to us. Our speaker today is one such example. Brooke very soon is going to have the honors to introduce our speaker, but I just wanted to express my deep gratitude and thanks to Chantal for taking the time to join us today. This speaker series is proudly supported by Arnold and Porter, and it is our honor to be hosting such cutting-edge discussions of very important voices that we must hear when we're thinking about investment law and policy. As I think everyone who has joined us knows, CCSI is on the cutting edge of moving forward the dialogue and discussion and thinking in this area. And I think it'll be apropos for me to pass the proverbial stage to the amazing Brooke Gowen to introduce CCSI and to introduce then our fabulous speaker. Brooke, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kabir, and thanks to Arnold and Porter for their sponsorship. And yes, welcome to everyone to our speaker series. The Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, for those who are not familiar, is a joint center of Columbia Law School and the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And we are a university-based applied research center and forum dedicated to the study, practice, and discussion of sustainable international investment. And today we are extremely excited to welcome for our first speaker to kick off this series, Dr. Chantal Ononaiwu. And we just went over the pronunciation, so I hope that was close. Who is the trade policy and legal specialist at the Caribbean community at Caricom. She's in the Secretariat's Office of Trade Negotiations, where she advises the community and its member states on a range of matters pertaining to international trade and investment. She's served as Caricom's negotiator on various subjects, including investment and its external trade negotiations, and has represented Caricom before the Caribbean Court of Justice. She's also a lecturer in international trade and investment law at the University of the West Indies. So without further ado, I will turn it over to her to discuss to give us a bit of her insights on investment treaty reform, continued priority or backburner issue. So Chantal, thank you.
Thank you so much to Brooke and to Kabir for that warm welcome. Greetings to everyone. I'd really like to thank the CCSI for inviting me to be a speaker in its International Investment Law and Policy Speaker Series. As Kabir mentioned, it's important for discussions on international investment law and policy to feature diverse perspectives. And so it's wonderful that during this week's series, various regional perspectives will be shared. Now, my talk today will address the issue of investment treaty reform. And this, of course, has been a very topical issue for several years. And so I'm pleased to have this opportunity to address this issue from the perspective of small states, and specifically the members of the Caribbean community. Now, a central theme of my talk is that small states should, and in fact do, have a strong interest in reform of the international investment regime. I'm going to show that Caricom countries are aware of the need to align international investment law and policy with their development imperatives. Going forward, Caricom countries are less likely, particularly when they negotiate as a community, to conclude the traditional variant of an investment treaty, which is almost exclusively focused on investment protection. What I want to stress is that they have developed this awareness in spite of the fact that they participate in comparatively fewer investment treaties and that they have been involved in comparatively fewer investor-state disputes. And quite recently, there's also been some attention in the region, including at the political level, on the issue of reform of the existing investment treaties of Caricom countries. And my talk is really going to focus on that issue. Now, like many other parts of the world, the Caribbean has been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been thousands of confirmed cases and hundreds of deaths. As one of the world's most tourism-dependent regions, the decline in this sector alone is going to have long-term negative impacts on businesses, livelihoods, and local economies. The sharp decline in government revenue is placing pressure on the already tight fiscal positions of countries in the region, many of which are highly indebted. And all of this is being faced in a context where it's predicted that there will be a drastic drop in FDI flows, which constitute a key source of external finance for Caricom countries. So understandably, governments in the region are preoccupied with addressing the health and economic impacts of the pandemic and in trying to spur economic recovery. And so in these circumstances, will investment treaty reform, and specifically reform of existing investment treaties, continue to be a priority? Or does it risk becoming a backburner issue? Now, my talk is unsurprisingly based on the premise that it needs to be a continued priority. And so in the remainder of my talk, I will address, in essence, three large sets of issues. First, I'm going to briefly review the investment treaty profile of Caricom countries and their experience with treaty-based investor-state disputes. Second, I'm going to highlight several developments or initiatives of Caricom countries that illustrate their awareness of the need to make investment treaties more sustainable development oriented. And finally, I'll speak to recent initiatives which have been undertaken in Caricom with respect to reform of existing treaties. And I'm going to highlight the importance of countries in the region building on these early initiatives and making concrete progress with respect to review and possible reform of their existing investment treaties. Now, particularly for those participants who may not be familiar with the investment treaty profile of Caricom countries and their experience with treaty-based investor-state disputes, I'm going to address that now. Now, Caricom is a regional organization of 15 Caribbean countries. And most of those countries participate in the Caricom single market, which has been established by our constituent treaty, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. And under this treaty, Caricom nationals have been given certain guarantees like the right of establishment and free movement of capital. And community nationals can also seek enforcement of these rights against governments before the Caribbean Court of Justice. Now, as a customs union, Caricom countries pursue a common external trade policy. And so Caricom countries have jointly negotiated external trade agreements. And the community's trade agreements with Costa Rica, with Cuba, and the Dominican Republic feature investment protection standards, and they allow investors to initiate arbitration against host states. The economic partnership agreements between the CARIFORUM states and the EU and the UK, they have more limited investment provisions, which don't extend to investment protection and investor-state dispute settlement. What's important to note is that a total of 82 bilateral investment treaties have been signed by CARICOM countries. And all CARICOM countries, except Montserrat, have signed at least one bilateral investment treaty. But the extent of the participation of CARICOM countries in BITS varies widely. On one end of the spectrum, you have the Bahamas and St. Kitts and Nevis. They've signed only one bilateral investment treaty and neither is in force. Then you have Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, Suriname, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. These 6 countries have signed between 2 and 4 bilateral investment treaties. Belize, Guyana, and Haiti have signed 8 or 9. And Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago have each signed more than 10 bilateral investment treaties. Now, what's important to note is that the overwhelming majority of these treaties are older generation treaties. They are almost exclusively investment protection focused. Many are very broad in scope in terms of what is protected and who is protected. Many feature uncircumscribed standards of protection of investors, including unqualified guarantees of most favored nation treatment, fair and equitable treatment, indirect expropriation, and obligations to facilitate the free transfer of funds subject to no exceptions. Umbrella clauses, which actually allow or guarantee that governments will respect any commitments entered into with respect to investment, including even contractual commitments. These feature in around 40 investment treaties of Caricom countries. A few of these treaties provide pre-establishment guarantees without any reservations for sensitive sectors and measures. And a few also contain specific disciplines on the use of performance requirements. With very few exceptions, these treaties also entitle foreign investors to international arbitration against host governments for treaty breaches with minimal preconditions. Now, more than 80% of these treaties, about 70 of them, were concluded over a decade ago, when the conventional wisdom was that investment protection focused treaties were instrumental in attracting foreign investment. Now, just as an illustration, 16 of Jamaica's 17 bilateral treaties were concluded between 1987 and 2003. 7 of Belize's 8 bilateral treaties were concluded between 1982 and 2005. And so again, most of these treaties really feature the traditional orientation of investment treaties. Now, to speak briefly about the experience that Caricom countries have had with investor-state dispute settlement arising under these investment agreements, 5 Caricom countries, Barbados, Belize, Grenada, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago, have faced arbitration initiated by investors under their bids. And the experience has really been mixed, because in most of these cases, the cases were either dismissed, they were discontinued, they were settled, or they were actually resolved in favor of the state. So for instance, Grenada's case, RSM Corporation and Grenada, which arose under its bilateral investment treaty with the United States, it was actually dismissed under ICSID's procedure for expeditious dismissal of patently unmeritorious claims. The tribunal actually found that this was nothing more than a contractual claim dressed up as a treaty claim, because the investor had actually unsuccessfully sued Grenada with respect to essentially the same measure in a previous contractual dispute. Guyana's claim, Booker PLC and Guyana, which dates back to the 90s, I believe, that arose under its bilateral investment treaty with the UK. It concerned the payment of outstanding compensation after Guyana nationalized its sugar industry, and the investor later discontinued those proceedings, so that case didn't go to the merits. Trinidad and Tobago has faced one treaty-based dispute, FW Oil Interests, was an American investor which sued under the bilateral investment treaty that Trinidad and Tobago has with the US, and that was resolved in favor of the state because the investment wasn't even found to fall within the definition of investment under the treaty. More recently, Barbados faced a dispute by a Canadian investor under its bilateral investment treaty with Canada. This is a case of Peter Allard and Barbados. And that case was decided in favor of the state. But what's so striking is that it still demonstrates how lengthy and costly investor-state dispute settlement proceedings can be for small states. 6 years elapsed between the commencement of arbitration in that case and the tribunal's award. And the state's cost, all of which were not recovered, exceeded 5.8 million US. And those costs included the fees of 16 lawyers and experts as well. Finally, Belize has faced 3 cases, BCBL and Belize, 2 installments of arbitration brought by Dunkeld Investments. And these 3 cases all arose under its bilateral investment treaty with the UK, and they were all related to measures that the government had taken to acquire control of telecommunications. Now, 2 of those cases were settled based on an agreement that there had been an expropriation and based on the tribunal's determination that compensation of over $96 million US had to be paid. And the other case was decided in favor of the investor with compensation of over 25 million US awarded. Now, what I want to stress here is that Belize faced multiple and parallel proceedings concerning the same measures, largely because the bilateral investment treaty didn't include preconditions like exhaustion of local remedies or a requirement that the investor at the outset had to make a choice of dispute settlement proceedings, the choice being final. Now, most countries in the region don't have an extensive network of investment treaties, and they clearly have not faced any disputes arising under their investment treaties. And so you may think that for a region with that investment treaty profile and that kind of limited experience with treaty-based investor-state disputes, investment treaty reform may not be really that high on the region's radar. But this is really not the case, because there's been a growing awareness on the part of Caricom countries about the risks associated with international investment agreements. In particular, the threats that investor-state dispute settlement poses to the state's ability to regulate in the public interest. And so I'm going to turn now to illustrations of that growing awareness. Now, there have been several initiatives which CARICOM countries have undertaken, which evidence their awareness of the need to ensure that international investment agreements, and actually more generally, the governance framework for investment, that they're aligned to their development objectives. And I'll just briefly speak to some of these initiatives. Back in 2017, the ACP group of states and UNCTAD jointly developed guiding principles for ACP countries' investment policy making. And as we may be aware, these are non-binding principles which recognize that investment policy making should serve to promote investment for inclusive growth and sustainable development. And so that notion has been signed on to by countries in the region and they're embodied in those principles. But I want to stress as well that sustainable development-oriented provisions have also featured in the treaty practice of CARICOM countries over the past decade. We see this in some of their more recently concluded bilateral investment treaties, like the cooperation and facilitation of investment agreements that Guyana and Suriname have concluded with Brazil. We also see this development in treaties which have been under negotiation by CARICOM countries over the past decade. This includes the CARICOM Investment Code, which is an intra-regional arrangement for the promotion, protection, and facilitation of investment within CARICOM. We've also seen this development as well in model treaty text. And so, for instance, a few years back, the community actually developed a template for investment chapters, which it may negotiate in the future in its external trade agreements. The national treaty models of some CARICOM countries have also featured sustainable development-oriented provisions. And so you may ask, well, when I'm talking about sustainable development-oriented provisions that have featured in the treaty practice of CARICOM countries more recently, what am I talking about? So I'm going to give a few examples. In some of the instruments I've mentioned, you'll note that there's an explicit reference to sustainable development in the treaty's objectives. What is striking as well is that the scope of which investments are protected and which investors are protected is also significantly more refined. For instance, you may note that there are in some treaties exclusions of certain sensitive areas like sovereign debt or speculative investment or short-term debt as well. There also is featuring in the more recent treaty practice of Caricom countries, either the clarification or the qualification, or in some cases, the exclusion of certain investor protections, which routinely featured in their older generation treaties. And here I'm speaking to elements like the most favored nation treatment provision, fair and equitable treatment, indirect expropriation, free transfer of funds, and the umbrella clause. And you will note that there are refinements or exclusion of some of these elements as an effort to safeguard the state's right to regulate. Some other examples I would just quickly cite are provisions that you see featuring to promote responsible investment, provisions to proactively promote and facilitate investment, and in some cases, radically different approaches to the settlement of investment disputes, which range from omitting investor-state dispute settlement altogether, for instance, as is evident in the agreements concluded by Suriname and Guyana with Brazil, or refining or limiting the access of investors to investor-state dispute settlement, or writing in certain improvements with respect to the investor-state dispute settlement procedure, if it is in fact provided for. But there's a third trend, which I think also reflects a growing awareness on the part of Caricom countries with respect to investor-state, with respect to international investment agreements. There's been a marked decline in the conclusion of investment treaties by Caricom countries. Few Caricom countries, including those with the most bilateral investment treaties, have actually concluded international investment agreements within the last 10 years. So remember, I started out by saying that there's a total of 82 bilateral investment treaties which Caricom countries have concluded. Within the last 10 years, only 12 have been concluded, and 9 of those 12 are not even in force. And I think that this mirrors global trends. Certainly, there's been an overall decline in the conclusion of these treaties by most countries, but I think it mirrors also greater caution on the part of Caribbean countries with respect to the conclusion of these agreements and greater awareness of their potential risks. I think it's also indicative of countries giving greater consideration of the extent to which there's a need to continue affording foreign investors this additional layer of protection that investment treaties provide, because of course, there is also protection available under domestic law and in some cases under investor-state contracts. And countries in the region are, I think, increasingly recognizing that investment treaties are not the sole driver of investment decisions. I think they're increasingly recognizing that there also needs to be a focus on measures that would improve the facilitation of investment and more broadly improve the investment climate or the business climate. And so in the last part of my talk, I'm going to just speak to the issue which has more recently captured the region's attention, and that's the reform of the existing investment treaties of Caricom countries. I think there has been within, I would say, the last year or two, greater recognition that Caricom countries need to undertake reviews of their existing bilateral investment treaties as part of an overall review of their investment policy framework. And they need to determine whether and how those treaties should be reformed. So in late September of last year, the Caricom Secretariat collaborated with UNCTAD, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development to convene a Caricom forum on international investment agreements. And officials from 14 Caricom countries participated in this forum, and they made some very important recommendations concerning review of the overall governance framework for investment, reform of their country's existing investment treaties, and reforms with respect to the future negotiation of such treaties. And I just wanted to highlight some of these recommendations. Now, with respect to the governance framework for foreign investment, officials recommended that CARICOM countries should review their concluded treaties. They should be looking at their content. They should be assessing their perceived risks and benefits. And very importantly, they should be assessing the compatibility of these treaties with current development agendas and imperatives. And in an almost prescient way, I think officials recognized that prolonging or delaying this work might heighten countries' exposure to investor-state dispute settlement. And I don't know if they were foreshadowing the current environment that we're in, because of course this issue has assumed even greater significance amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, because the potential exposure of CARICOM countries like other countries with international investment treaties to COVID-19 related investor-state claims has really underscored the importance of assigning priority to investment treaty reform. Now, even though the focus of the forum was on investment treaties, it was recognized that other aspects of the governance framework for investment, domestic laws, contracts, they also need to be supportive of sustainable development outcomes. And so it was also recognized that in addition to reviewing investment treaties, there really needed to be a review of the effectiveness of domestic law and courts and other mechanisms for settling investment disputes. Now, on the specific subject of investment treaty reform, officials recommended that the review of existing investment treaties could inform decisions on whether various reform options should be pursued. And I think based on the outcome of the reviews conducted, any number of the options I'm going to briefly outline could actually be in play. It was noted that quite a number of the existing investment treaties have not entered into force, and so express abandonment of unratified treaties could be an option. Similarly, recognizing that there were a number of standards like the Fair and Equitable Treatment Standard, which really were totally unqualified. One option could be issuing joint interpretive declarations. Now, perhaps the other two options might seem a bit more ambitious and daunting, and they're really renegotiation of these treaties. This is in the event that countries, after completing their review, believe that continuing with an investment treaty arrangement is desirable. I would have highlighted before a number of aspects of these treaties which could be potentially revisited. Yet another option is terminating old generation treaties. And what I find striking is that this is an option which is already being pursued by some of the treaty partners of CARICOM countries. And so India, for instance, terminated its bilateral investment treaty with Trinidad and Tobago a few years ago. Indonesia is another treaty partner of some CARICOM countries, which has also embarked on a program of termination of its investment treaties. Officials had also acknowledged the value of engaging in multilateral reform processes, such as the deliberations of UNCITRAL on ISDS reform. There are mixed views about what the UNCITRAL deliberations will generate, but some of the outcomes could potentially be high impact. And so it's somewhat unfortunate that to date, countries in the region have not actively been participating in these discussions. Finally, I would just note that it was recognized that there are a number of preparatory actions that countries would have to undertake if they're pursuing investment treaty reform. And I'll just mention a couple which I think are really significant. One is ensuring that there's coordination and coherence across various governmental ministries and agencies that may have some remit over investment policy making and actually the administration of laws that govern investment. And another one, there are many others I could mention, but I'm quite cognizant of the time. The other one I want to stress is the importance of examining what treaty partners have done in their newer treaties and in their models. There are partners such as the United States, Canada, India, and the Netherlands, which have actually undertaken reforms in their investment treaty models or in their more recently negotiated treaties. And so moving to a more sustainable development oriented treaty model may not be as far-fetched as countries may initially contemplate it would be. Now, I just want to end by stressing that while there is clearly value in Caricom at the level of the community continuing to engage on this issue collectively, and there will be continued collective engagement on the issue, this really shouldn't forestall action on the part of individual countries with respect to their bilateral investment treaties. And so I was quite heartened to learn that there are some individual countries of Caricom which have actually, since the forum held last year, they have initiated reviews of their existing stock of treaties. Now, to end, I just point out that in the post-pandemic period, Caricom countries, like others, we will face the challenge of how to make the best use of investment policies in bringing back our economies onto a sustainable development path. But in confronting this real challenge, it's important that we ensure that investment treaty reform, it's not relegated to a backburner issue, but that it really remains a priority. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal, for giving a really comprehensive overview of the history and the current state of play of ISDS and sort of treaty reform efforts in the region. That was really interesting. We do have a couple of questions, and I would encourage anyone to put a question into the Q&A box, and we will get to them. I first just wanted to sort of follow up on something you raised at the very end about, you know, sort of the preparatory steps that will need to be taken in order for reform to happen. And you mentioned ensuring coordination and coherence across ministries at the national level, and then examining what treaty partners have done. I'm wondering if you see any role or how the Caricom Secretariat fits into this at the regional level, and whether there are any gaps either at the national level or international level to ensure that these kind of actions and treaty upgrading are taking place. Do you see gaps, or where do you see opportunities for further engagement there so that countries can really do this?
Thanks, Brooke. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I actually see more opportunity than gaps, and I'm going to focus on those. To answer your first question about the role of the Secretariat has an instrumental role to play, and it will continue to play that role. It serves a very important coordination role. It serves also a very important role in terms of capacity building. And just to use the forum that we engaged in last year, we initiated that particular event because we recognized that sometimes to actually push forward the right kind of deliberations, the right kind of consideration of the issue, you have to ensure that officials are properly seized of the relevant issues. So that forum actually had a dual role. We actually had a very strong training and capacity building component, which actually took place first, which allowed officials to actually get into the weeds of their treaties, to actually examine them, not necessarily look at an assessment that someone else had done of their treaties for them, but to actually do that work themselves. And with that appreciation, they were actually very well positioned to engage in the more strategic decision-making on the questions of review of the governance framework and future and IIA reform, because that grounding existed. And that kind of role of capacity building and facilitating strategic deliberations and decision making, I think is a role that the Secretariat is going to have to continue to play. The Secretariat also has to play that role because, as I mentioned, some of the existing international investment agreements are trade agreements which are community negotiated agreements. And so for those treaties to be reformed so that it's not just an exercise, well, reviewed and possibly reformed, so it's not just an exercise that's limited to the bilateral investment treaties, it's certainly going to have to be pushed by the community. Now, in terms of the second part of your question with respect to, gaps or opportunities which may exist, what I would say is that there are real capacity constraints in this area with that Caricom countries face. But what we have found is that there are so many opportunities for collaboration, which I think can allow countries to face those constraints head on. I gave an example of collaboration that the Secretariat engaged in with other international partners. And that is something that we'll continue to explore, but there's so many tools. There are so many policy tools which are actually ready and available for countries to actually utilize if they want to start tackling this question of investment treaty reform. I mean, UNCTAD just, I think earlier this month, launched its IIA Reform Accelerator, which is something which any government which actually wants to kickstart the work on investment treaty reform can actually do. So that's just my preliminary answer to your question about the role of the Secretariat and gaps and opportunities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Chantal. That was amazing. I really do think you gave us an overview about a region that sometimes doesn't get focused on, even though there is something very significant for us to be thinking about. I feel the facts that you also raised, that these are all these first generation treaties, does raise something that we really got to think about. Our current understanding has really moved away from that model, but you're stuck. So thank you very much. Let me ask you a question that we received from one of our colleagues and friends, Howard Mann, and he says, a lot of discussions and points that you have touched upon really get to the substantive content of these treaties, right? Now, if we're looking at the global efforts to reform ISDS, and the most prominent, of course, is UNCTAD Working Group 3, right? The mandate there is just procedural, right? So you're going to look at dispute resolution, but that is somehow a given, and we're going to try and tinker with that process. And I think this is the question, really, right? If you're talking about reform, and there are very legitimate questions on substance, but the global efforts are only on procedure, what are the preconditions for motivating and achieving substantive reform? I know there's a lot there, and this is the billion-dollar question, but I do think we will benefit from your exposition.
Thanks, Howie. I can always trust Howie to direct at me very pointed questions, and I have not been disappointed on this occasion. But what Howie has raised is a very important question for, I think, the global community, which is participating more broadly in the UNCTAD Working Group 3 discussions. It's a very germane issue which has been raised by a number of stakeholders in those talks. Okay, the mandate is ISDS reform, but if we engage in procedural reform, even if it's far-reaching, the fact is we are still applying those procedural reforms with respect to a very significant body of treaties, which are older generation models, which are, as I said, very investment protection focused. So even if you have reforms that take place at the procedural level, but you're still interpreting an unqualified, fair and equitable treatment obligation without much kind of interpretive guidance, there is no guarantee that without reform of the substance, the sustainable development oriented outcomes that countries are reaching for would necessarily be secured. So the point is certainly taken there. With respect to substantive reform, my personal view is that countries have to take control of the treaties that they are already parties to. They don't have to wait on a multilateral process to do that. There's no guarantee that there will be any kind of multilateral process that will be initiated anytime soon that will generate the kind of far-reaching substantive reform that might be desired. But all of those reforms, all of those reform options, which I indicated that officials at our forum last year had identified, they're on the table. They are, and if we just use, as I said, the Caribbean countries as an example, I mean, for a country like the Bahamas, there's one investment treaty. It's not yet ratified. So, you know, if you review that treaty and you're not quite comfortable with the content, there's a very clear step that you can take. If you are a country like Jamaica or Barbados or Trinidad and Tobago, there may be more work you've got to undertake because you have a larger body of treaties to review. And assuming that your review is guided by a broader perspective or vision of the role that you think investment should play in your sustainable development goals or the achievement of your sustainable development outcomes, then the question really is, you know, what are the concrete steps that I can take? And so for me, I'm actually more hopeful that reform might actually be spurred or generated by countries taking that bold step to undertake actions with respect to their own treaties. I'm not as buoyant about the prospects of multilateral solutions in that regard.
Thanks, Chantal. We have another question that goes to sort of the role of investment treaties overall and the role of the public interest in those. So this question is particularly stating that, you know, the role of international treaties is not actually to attract foreign investment, but rather to impose and ensure adherence to international law. So, you know, in that vein, how might and should the public interest so the question is that you're equating the public interest as freedom from constraints from international law. How might you respond to that? And how do you see the role for the public interest as interacting with or taking a part of international law in that way?
Right, so to be clear, I don't perceive pursuit of public interest issues as necessarily meaning that the perceived shackles of international law need to be removed altogether. What I'm actually speaking to is more, I'm actually reaching for something a little bit different. My starting point is, even if countries decide that there is value in providing investors with guarantees via investment treaties, it's important for those countries to think very clearly about, well, what type of international framework would be more compatible or conducive to the outcomes that I want to secure? So I think that's a question that even countries that decide that they want to continue to participate in the international investment regime need to grapple with. So for me, it's not a binary choice of, you know, remove yourself from the international legal order or participate in it. My thinking is, even for countries who are desirous of continuing to participate in the international investment regime, I think pursuit of public interest concerns are, I think, well safeguarded by an international legal order that achieves greater balance, that recognizes that there are circumstances in which the public interest requires the state to take measures which may impose constraints on private freedoms, and to construct an international legal order and a framework, if settlement of investment disputes is accommodated, that facilitates those public interest considerations or the need of the state to safeguard the public interest being accommodated.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chantal. With many apologies, I'm going to do something very inelegant. I'm going to combine two questions. We're getting a lot of good questions, and I think we want to try and cover as many as possible. And the good thing is we're getting questions from different perspectives. So the first question we get is a question from Belize. So I think it's important to have one coming from something, it troubled me, it troubled Brooke, it troubled the region as well, right? Talking about a lot of these treaties that are really old, that need to be upgraded and renegotiated. And really, what do you see as being the solution for that? And just generally, I think you've previewed a little bit about that already, but do you look at a multilateral investment agreement being like a possibility in the future? So that's one question, with many apologies. The second question really is, really looking at the cultural aspects of the Caribbean, the Caricom countries, right? There is, a greater appreciation for nature, a greater appreciation for, quality of life, right? Things, which is why I think everybody from North America likes to come to the Caribbean. And this is the question, right? Do you look at foreign investment, these investment treaties potentially changing that lifestyle? Are you going to see a cultural influence beyond just the foreign investment aspect? So I think two very different questions, but two interesting ones.
Okay, I'm going to tackle the second one first based on my understanding of the question. I think this is how I'm going to choose to answer the question. I think that countries need to see their participation in international law as something which needs to reflect their own priorities. And CARICOM countries have their own development priorities, and yes, many of those development priorities are oriented towards ensuring that the quality of life that we want our citizens to have can be secured, amongst other things. And so I think that's kind of where I was reaching for when I said that in reviewing these treaties, current countries need to bring to the fore, or countries need to bring to the fore what their current development imperatives and agendas are, and to see whether these treaties line up with their current development agendas and priorities. If it's one thing I can say quite confidently about the region is that there is a continuing effort to articulate development priorities and strategies, both at the level of individual countries with their national development plans and strategies, and also at the level of the community, because the community also articulates its own strategic plan. And I think it's important for countries to ensure that this part of the international treaty framework is aligned to those imperatives that they have. I don't know if I fully answered the question of the participant, but that's the angle I want to use or the frame I wanted to use to respond to the question. Now, the former question is a tough one in the sense of, I'm not so sure that in the short term there is appetite for a multilateral agreement that would, if you wish, set the floor in the way that the multilateral agreements of the WTO do in the realm of trade. There have been so many attempts at this, developing a multilateral framework. The current game in town at the multilateral level where substance is concerned is, of course, the joint statement initiative of quite a number of WTO members to develop an agreement on investment facilitation for development. And what's again very striking is there is absolutely no appetite amongst the participants to discuss substance beyond what they perceive is relevant to facilitating investment. And it seems like it's probably more specifically foreign direct investment. The participants have explicitly excluded questions of market access, questions of investment protection, questions of investor-state dispute settlement. And they're going to great lengths actually to ensure that the two regimes are completely firewalled and insulated from each other. If we use that as a barometer of what the level of interest in a multilateral agreement that deals with substance would be, it suggests that at the moment there isn't a lot of appetite for that. Having said that, I'm not going to foreclose the possibility that at some point in the future, that kind of interest may be generated. What I do want to stress, to go back to the other first part of your question, Kabir, is that we don't have to wait to find out what the crystal ball is going to materialize. I mean, countries already have the power to as I said, take a look at what they already have, what commitments they've already signed on to, and determine whether those commitments within the context of their current development imperatives and agendas are desirable for them.
Thanks, Chantal. So I have one quick follow-up on what you just spoke about, and then I'll also raise another question from the chat. In terms of a multilateral sort of framework agreement, at the WTO level, you know, with all of the WTO member states, that does seem daunting or more challenging. Do you think there's a role, though, at the regional level to do something where countries might be more aligned sort of within the CARICOM region to have a more sustainability focus in some kind of regional agreement? So that's my follow-up question. And then as one of the questions that we have from the chat is about the role of public participation in negotiations. And I would extend that, taking liberties to extend it to reform, also negotiations. So that, you know, investment treaties are often criticized for the non-transparency of both the negotiations and then also the disputes. So how, there's not a question here, so I'm forming it into a question, but it's, you know, how would you view the role of citizen participation, both as to the substantive outcome and impacts on the country, as well as sort of the perceived legitimacy of the role of international investment law in this way? So that's two questions. So hopefully you were taking notes if that was too much, but sorry.
No, I think I remember them, and please give me a little reminder if I haven't responded to both adequately. But the first part of your question, which goes to regional initiatives, the short answer is yes. And one of the initiatives that I had spoken about, well, I had actually touched on two initiatives which we are undertaking, which actually do have that more sustainable development oriented bent. And so what I'll do is just spend a little time talking about both a bit more. Now, you probably noted that when I tried to give an overview of the existing treaty practice of Caribbean countries, I started by talking about our own intra-regional arrangement that has established a single market. And that arrangement does provide some basic guarantees already to any person who qualifies as a community national, as I said, guarantees of the free transfer of funds, free movement of capital, and also guarantees of the right of establishment. So from an almost market access perspective, because the goal was to establish a single market, there's already quite a bit of that has been achieved there. But there was a decision taken as well that it would be desirable to conclude an arrangement that would ensure that there are some minimum, I guess if you wish, standards of treatment that any investor of a CARICOM country could enjoy with respect to investments that investor made within CARICOM. And so that has led to actually an almost 20-year effort to develop what we refer to as the CARICOM Investment Code, but it's really an intra-regional treaty for the promotion, facilitation, and protection of investment within CARICOM. And many of those features that I outlined before, from even recognition of sustainable development as an objective to, you know, how the standards of protection are formulated, have been very much influenced by an appreciation of the change in investment treaty making and international investment policy making. And so it's a much more sustainable development oriented text. It's draft text though, it's not yet finalized. And as I said, another important initiative that we undertook was recognizing that as a community, we may in our external trade, in our negotiations of external trade agreements, possibly negotiate commitments on investment. We developed a template for what an investment chapter in an external trade agreement should look like. And that's a very sustainable development oriented template as well. But of course it's a template, so it has to evolve. It has to move, but that's the starting point of where we're at. On the second, with respect to the second question you posed, Brooke, that's exactly one of the preparatory actions that I kind of skipped over when I was coming towards the end of my presentation. Officials recognized that there is really a need in this process of reviewing existing investment treaties, in the process of deciding what steps to take with respect to treaties once that review has been completed. And more importantly, the process of reviewing the governance framework for investment generally, which is not just investment treaties, but also the domestic legal framework, that process has to engage at the domestic level a wide range of stakeholders. It has to engage the private sector, which is not just foreign investors, but of course, other economic actors operating in our economies. It has to engage them. It has to engage civil society, the academic community, various interest groups as well. That was recognized to be a very important component, which I think has to imbue any effort at reform. Because again, that's again how you ensure that the outcome is aligned to current development agendas and imperatives.
That's fantastic, Chantal. Thank you so much. We're going to keep our eye out to look at this template and see the form it takes. So that is exciting. With your kind indulgence, perhaps I could ask one brief question, pass it to Brooke, who will ask you one brief question, and then you could, with your indulgence, just answer both of these together. I think these are questions we are interested in, so we are going to totally abuse our prerogative of having the mic. But Chantal, you have this great experience, looking at this issue at a regional level. And, at CCSI, a very core factor that we focus on is sustainable investment, right? And this is my question. We give you all the magical power in the world, Chantal, and we tell you there is one change you can bring to accomplish sustainable investment. What is that one thing you would like to see that can at least take us closer towards this goal of this very broad goal of sustainable investment? I know there's no easy answer here, but we would love to see what you're thinking about. Brooke, maybe I pass it to you to ask your question.
Although that's a good one to end on, especially with 2 minutes to let you answer that. But you touched on COVID at the end. I feel like that's a very pressing issue right now. And very quickly, I just thought it would be interesting to know if the countries in the region have any practical ideas on how they manage or would manage claims that may arise under the COVID context. And if there's any initiatives toward any steps to sort of help countries control and manage those kind of claims.
Okay, I'm going to answer Brooke's question first, and then I'm going to end with Kabir's question with my magical pause. But Brooke, your question, the short answer to your question is the issue has been raised even at a community level, meaning the importance of recognizing that there is this potential exposure that countries face, either arising under their treaties, but also their contracts, and even under domestic law, with respect to defending these types of claims. And there has been recognition of this potential risk. To be very honest with you, I don't get a sense that there have been very concrete initiatives which have been developed. Say in the way that I'm aware that the African Union, for instance, has sought to take concrete measures in this area. What I would say is this, that based on my understanding of the types of measures which countries have been taken, and there's been quite a lot of tracking, including based on work that the university has undertaken, the University of the West Indies has undertaken. I really think one of the most important actions that governments could take in a very practical way, and this is not dependent on even what a treaty partner agrees to or doesn't agree to do. I really think that countries could try, even though this is no safeguard, this is no assurance of any outcome, they could try and ensure that when they take these measures, and there's been some months that countries have had with experience with developing these measures, that they try and apply these measures in a non-discriminatory manner as much as possible, that they try and reduce the scope for arbitrariness or, you know, very unclear exercise of discretion. That is something that countries have control over. And if they take those measures, I think it might improve their ability to address any concerns that are raised about these measures, whether these concerns are raised in the context of contractual obligations, they're raised in the context of a claim arising under domestic law, or they're even raised in the context of a potential treaty claim. And I'm saying this stressing that based again on the investment treaty profile that I explained to you that countries in the region have, some have far less exposure to treaty-based claims than others do. But it doesn't mean that because you may not have an extensive network of treaties, this is not an important issue for you. Even from the perspective of administration of your domestic law or your contractual obligations, you still have to be thinking about this issue. And I think from either a dispute prevention perspective or even from the perspective of addressing a concern or a grievance if it is raised, I think the state's chances of dealing appropriately with any concerns would be increased if they have sought to either develop or administer these measures in a non-discriminatory or in a way or in a manner which isn't arbitrary. Going to Kabir's question, that loaded question, if I had the magical pause with respect to sustainable investment, I think it would be this. I think I would want to confer on countries, and I'm going to give this answer probably more so in a Caribbean context to end. I would confer on our governments, or I would ensure that our governments have the confidence to make decisions about what kind of investment actually furthers the sustainable development trajectory they've already set for themselves. If they have that, to me, so much would follow. So much would logically follow from that. They would focus their efforts on the type of investment that they believe is worth attracting, retaining, and trying to have expanded in their countries, and creating the environment that would make that kind of investment come to their shores. I think with that confidence, they probably would also be very clear in what actions they would have to take with respect to legal frameworks that are either supportive or not supportive of the goals that they want to pursue. So I think that would probably be the magic power. And I'm not being, you know, I'm not being arrogant in thinking that governments don't think about this, but it would be in ensuring that there is that confidence that they have, that when they do regulate, that they can take steps that would be very much oriented towards the outcomes they want.
On that positive note, we've gone a few minutes over, but this has been such an engaging discussion, and I really want to extend my thanks to Kabir for co-moderating and hosting this, and also to Dr. Chantal Ononaiwu for her really thoughtful presentation and remarks, and to all of you for joining. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Stay healthy, everyone.
My pleasure as well. Take care, everyone, and thank you as well.
Bye, everybody. Bye.